Talking about me, like when I would think about the kind of workplace I want to work in, I want it to be diverse for sure.
Me as a millennial, if I see that it's a company that does not care about diversity, does not care about equality, I'm not even going to consider it as a potential employer at all.
Diversity is something natural to our generation. We are not questioning it.
No, yeah, maybe people nowadays say, yeah, just because you're a woman, you're more likely to get a job now. I don't even like that aspect of it either. I want to get a job and I want to achieve stuff because I am capable, because I have studied so hard to get to where I am.
Well, definitely I want to be hired because I have some unique skills, or I can serve the company and help them to achieve their vision.
And I think right now there is a lot of movement forward. And some people believe that they can stay behind, that it's okay to not follow because one day it will go back. What if it doesn't? What if you end up on that line, looking at everyone running ahead and you're waiting for them to come back?
Well, thank you for that. It's a pleasure to be here, and I must say a great pleasure to be in a minority on this panel.
We need a man.
This month would have been the 100th birthday of Irving Janis, who was the man who developed and popularized the theory of groupthink. And we are in the business of trying to work out how we avoid groupthink at work, of which diversity and diverse voices and diverse thinking and diverse people are among the ways in which one can avoid that. Let me briefly introduce the panel. On my immediate left is Sung-Joo Kim, Chair of MCM Holding. I should add that Sung-Joo needs to make a quick getaway at the end today, so she wanted me just to apologize on her behalf if she doesn't get to talk to people who want to talk to her straight afterwards. To her left, Cathy Benko from Deloitte, and at the far end, rather far away, Bob Bland, who is now best known, I think, for being the co-founder of the Women's March, the movement that erupted after the election of Donald Trump in the United States in 2016.
Okay, good job.
So I want to get straight into the discussion, but we're going to leave plenty of time for your input at the end, and I hope we get as many different voices and different types of voice at the end coming in with questions and comments. Let me just start by trying to ask each of you, and starting with Cathy, what do you think is one practical thing that everyone can do to ensure diversity in the workplace?
Well, I certainly think from an organizational perspective, changing the lens. So, for example, and even just in the last 2 days, I've heard the term the corporate ladder, I don't know how many times. Everybody's climbing the ladder. And when you think about the ladder, that's actually a very industrial lens. Indeed, it was, kind of came into vogue at the start of the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, they were systematizing the shop floor. The idea was also to systematize the human component, how you dealt with people and how careers were built. And if you look at that model, it's predicated on a couple of things. One, the workforce was very homogeneous. The ideas around status and reward and prestige and access to information and sort of power really was predicated on what rung you sat on. But we've, as has been well discussed during this symposium, we've well left the days of the industrial era, and we're well, 20 years plus maybe, into the digital age. And the latter is actually a constraining, it's almost like an artifact from the industrial age that, kind of still finds its way into our corporate cranium. So, expanding that model from a ladder, we like to call it a lattice, the corporate lattice. You can argue it's a grid, it's a matrix, whatever you want, is much more in line with how both the workforce, much more heterogeneous, and the workplace operates. So careers, we think, go like this, but if you actually plotted most people's careers, they go something like that today. We all think we're the exception. We're not. We're actually the rule. And when you look at the role of influencers, it's very different than sort of the power-based roles. And if you can extend the model from a ladder to something like a lattice, you open the aperture for all kinds of ways to make progress on many fronts, including the topic of inclusion, because it's a lot easier for people to find not just themselves, but each other on a grid or a lattice than you do on a ladder.
Thanks for that. This is a good moment to introduce just the poll question that we've been wrestling with behind stage from last-minute editing. For live voting purposes, this is the question. Have you ever helped a colleague who was not a white man to achieve a significant step or transformation in their career? 4 options there, and we will come back to the answer to that later in the session. Have you ever helped a colleague who was not a white man to achieve a significant step or transformation in their career? And maybe you'll have questions about the question later on. Let me turn to Bob, because somebody who would definitely answer yes very often to that question. What's the practical thing do you think people can do to improve and enlarge the aperture as Cathy has described it?
Well, the practical thing you can do is be intentional, because most of us have some form of power in our professional lives. So even if you are managing a very small group of people, if you are considering starting up a venture as an entrepreneur, or if you have access to executive management or to the board or to the shareholders of a company to demand diversity and to demand inclusion as a part of the DNA of the company that you are working with or for, that is something where you have a voice. Every single person here has a voice, and collectively and individually, our voices matter. Our choices matter as well. So even if you're working in a school group, or if you're working on a particular research project, be intentional and have the lens of inclusion with you at all times, and speak up when you find that the community is not being representative in the power structures of your group, of your school, of your company, or elsewhere in your life.
So you triggered, Bob, a tremendous community movement, possibly intentionally, well, certainly intentionally, but perhaps you didn't envisage it being quite as big and quite as dominant in your life now when you first, I think you posted on Facebook.
Yeah, I made a Facebook event.
So that's
that's why I'm here right now.
Yeah, several events. Like 600 events, I think it was in the end, wasn't it? But the question I suppose I have from that is, does it have to be done at scale, or can the sponsorship of one person or a couple of people be enough of an intention? Or are we at the stage where in order to change the balance of power, you need to do things on scale, possibly not on the scale that you envisage, but...
The power dynamics that we find in the Western world are created through a systemic level of reinforcement of government, of the private sector, of nonprofits. Everyone is complicit in some way in upholding a system that is not diverse, and all of us can share in the challenge together of creating a new system. And a lot of it starts with vision. It's not enough to just react to the system that we have and say, well, it will get better with time. We cannot afford to be complacent in this moment, and particularly with millennials, with Gen Z on the horizon, we are demanding more. For myself as a fashion entrepreneur, I knew when I got pregnant with my first daughter in 2008 that there was no way that my industry was going to accept what I needed as a mother, which was not to only see my child for a few hours every day. I knew that I was going to be the type of mother that I needed to actually have a real relationship with my child. Now, at the same time, I love my career. I'm good at what I do. I deserve to be able to do that. And so for myself, along with many millennials, we opted for entrepreneurship. So when we talk about the gig economy, when we talk about all of these new structures in the workplace, a lot of that is as a result of people's careers not fitting their real lives. And so to your point, we have to be able to accommodate that, but then we also have to be able to acknowledge the way that systemically one individual person, yes, can have a ripple effect in the way that I made a call and Teresa Shook made a call to women saying, hey, we need to march on Washington on January 21st. And that sparked in people's imagination something that became a movement of millions, and that continues to this day. So yes, individuals matter, but that does not mean that we don't also have to hold our power structures, whether it be government or billionaires and millionaires in the private sectors or any other person who has power. We need to hold them accountable as well.
Thank you. Sung-Joo, what's the practical thing that you have done or think can be done by people in the workplace to change?
Well, first of all, can I congratulate the symposium to include so many women, also a final session like this, which is very precious, respectful. In fact, about 1997, 21 years ago, when I was selected as one of GLT by Davos, there was no women in the podium and no women in the even audience, just very seldom. So I questioned the senior, I would not mention the name, the senior figurehead there, why no women? The answer was very clear, not many qualified one up to this level. So have you given the opportunity? That was my question. But now this time, when I was Davos this January, past January, now all co-chair, 5 of them, all women, and almost 40% above in the panelists and also moderator were women. So I have to congratulate both Davos and Gallen Symposium. For me, I just want to share a little reverse case. In fact, as you know, I come from Asian, Korea, and Korea and Japan known one of the worst working place for women concerned because of Confucius tradition and also samuraism. And so my case was coming from very discriminative kind of a background. You can imagine, meanwhile, my old brothers inherit multi-billion energy in an empire. Me alone, just supposed marrying to another power marriage as subservient wife. When I revert against, I was completely disowned. That's my story began. So I purposely made my first mission is I want to prove the society. Instead of being a militant feminist, why don't I just prove it women can excel? Which it happened. Of course, we have to adapt more IT, something enabler to succeed, to be faster, accurate, ahead of the game than just being women. However, what I want to say is, not many men, qualified men, want to come work for me. That was another problem. So I had to hire many women, not employed by others. So now 80% of my 1,500 colleagues are women, 80%. And now I'm facing reverse case. Don't discriminate men. So we are truly the very women-led company, but proven one thing is a global scale. Maybe because the sector I belong to, which is a more retailing and branding, women are very good in soft power. And also we have a great cultural sensitivity observed. Therefore, I have 37 national background colleagues working with me in 15 offices in 40 countries, and also 500 stores get going every day. Now we are moving into more mobile e-commerce and digital transformation also. But one thing I want to say is, I think the best ways that we prove it through our working place that how women relate to colleagues differently, instead of very top-down, very horizontal, and cultural adaptability is something much far intuitively better. And also, as you know, out of this internet revolution, what matters? Mobile e-commerce leading. I mean, the speed of technology and the advance is just light speed. And also, it's very, truly global kind of a speed and connectivity. And also, we are facing this new generation taking on. So who can be bridging from the very old industry to really unprecedented kind of new techno-driven future? I think women's leadership really comes in. So for me, it's not men and women's things. Now we are facing AI. The subject of this conference is end of work. Certain new era emerged. New leadership required, I think it's not men and women things. It's a human brain versus AI. So how can men and women can bring their different strengths, complementary together, harmonize it, create a synergy to compete the AI, that's the future. So women's diversity, all these inclusiveness, and also racial groups, whatever, these are compulsory.
Yes, thank you, Sung-Joo. I think that's a useful reminder that obviously the panel is structured as though it looks as though we are talking only about gender diversity, but we're talking about
racial,
all types of diversity, including, I think, different ways of thinking, which is obviously the key to getting better ideas. Cathy, maybe I could ask you, because you have that sort of wide view of number of sectors from where you sit at Deloitte, where do you think we're up to in trying to get more diversity? I mean, clearly, as some of the students said in the video, there has been progress and there will be more progress, and I'm optimistically hope there'll be a tipping point where suddenly things will change quite dramatically. But where do you think actually the world of work, I suppose I'm talking about established companies, where are we up to?
Well, first of all, the conversation is happening, like really happening. And I think everybody's really well-intentioned. And I'm really a little surprised in a very good way that being the last session on the last day, that this audience is as full as any other session. So I think actually that speaks volumes for, you know, this is the moment, right? I mean, things happen overnight after they take, you know, many years to do that. There certainly is, however, more work to be done. And again, if I look at it organizationally, I really think at this point, one of this is my own opinion, part of the bottleneck now is actually having those, you know, kind of management opportunities and the like available for people to fill. It's a really sort of interesting couple of dynamics here. One, the layers in the average enterprise have decreased by 25%. So, and in some organizations, it's closer to 50%. And so when in the past you would hinge success on sort of that next rung, one of the problems with that is, well, now as an organization, are you saying that there are fewer opportunities to be successful? So the idea of opening the aperture helps with that. But the other thing that happens, and this is, I'll just kind of in slang call it term limits. You know, people in leadership roles are there for actually a really long time. And it's actually not really in anybody's best interest. If you look at how quickly things are changing, the notion of staying relevant, each one of us as individuals and contributors to, you know, as CEOs of our own careers, staying relevant is an important part. And when you're doing the same role, and tends to be, you know, let's say manager and above, for many years, you're probably not staying on the edge of relevance as an individual, and there's not opportunities. I cannot tell you how many organizations, for example, that have these invest great sums of money in leadership development programs for all types of diverse candidates. But then you come back and it's like, well, but nobody's moving. There aren't necessarily the opportunities to prove yourself and the like. And so that is one way to set expectations of every individual. You're not entitled to that position. We want you in that position. We want you to do well. If it's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it is, but don't get too comfortable, because the idea of moving people around helps not just each of us as individuals, but certainly helps the diversity and inclusion agenda as well.
Right, certainly one of the things I notice is that the inertia of the system is quite awe-inspiring. You know, the fact of not changing is much easier for a lot of organisations. Bob, I wondered if one of the things, obviously your movement has hit the headlines, but last year obviously we had Me Too and the Harvey Weinstein scandals, and that really does seem to have thrown a grenade into the discussion in a way that actually has made a lot of people, even the academy, the Oscar-giving Academy recognize things that they probably should have recognized years earlier as being completely beyond the pale. Has that been an important driver, do you think?
I think we've seen, in regards to the Me Too movement, we've seen across sectors a ripple effect because there are women working across all different industries. And so the Me Too movement, many of us have been sitting on these stories for years, just sucking it up, believing that it was just part of it and that we just had to deal with it. I certainly can count on a few hands the different scenarios just with venture capitalists alone. And so I think that the Me Too movement would not have gained as much steam as it did because it's actually existed. Tarana Burke created the hashtag #MeToo 10 years ago. And it gained steam because of the cultural narrative that we're creating. And all of us storytellers, people who work in journalism, in graphic design, in any sort of culture, publishing, have a tool that they can use to keep this narrative going and to keep unraveling the different ways that the assumptions that we're making, the ways that we are acting, are actually hurting ourselves and our ability to innovate within our industry. Because one thing that has been good through the Me Too movement is it is creating the openings that you're talking about. A lot of people who were very entrenched in toxic systems that were very exclusive and hurting a lot of people in the process have now been divested of their roles. And that has created a lot of upper management and executive leadership opportunities. So there has been a power shift, but it shouldn't take that level of violent change, in companies for this to happen. And again, it comes back to intentionality. I've heard a lot at this conference about innovation, and I often hear about this throughout industries, like how are we constantly pushing forward? Like even this idea of beyond work. How are we pushing ourselves forward? But we need to start seeing diversity as our competitive edge. Companies need to start looking and saying, hey, this is my selling point to my shareholders. This is my selling point to investors, is my diversity. And the truth is what I've seen working with Women's March is, I know we had a Forbes piece come out at the time in January 2017 saying it was the most successful social enterprise of all time. And it was, for me as an entrepreneur, I was sitting there, well, like, okay, yeah, I'll take that. But the truth was that it wasn't me as an individual, it was the diversity of women, of men, of gender nonconforming people, of people from marginalized communities holding and sharing this vision and building together. And we can have that. It doesn't just have to be activism. It doesn't have to just be in politics. We can have that in our workplaces, but we have to make the room for that first. And I think that that's the true innovation of Women's March, was opening the space for that sort of diversity.
Right. I think you went out expressly, didn't you, to choose 3 co-chairs.
Well, yeah.
Who represented different, well, they looked different. I mean, you had a diverse group.
I wouldn't say that I was not born woke. If you've heard that term woke, yeah, no, not me. I had not been able to put a critical racial lens or even a critical gender lens to my work previously, and a lot of that was because I was also entrenched in the system. And I was not really thinking about that. I hadn't learned enough, and it's our duty to educate our children and young people in our lives about all of the different social justice and civil rights movements across the world that have come before us. Because once I had tens of thousands of people messaging me on Facebook, I learned a lot very quickly.
Right.
And one of the things that I learned was that was about that original idea of intentionality in inclusion, and that this movement could not be successful. There's no point in having another feminist movement if it is not intersectional, if it is not across all of the different ways that women identify themselves in the world.
Right. Sung-Joo, on that point, I mean, how far do you go? You're talking
movement.
about, well, I'm thinking more of the way in which you might structure a team, so it was
I just
intentionally diverse.
Say something funny.
Please, yes, do say.
I want to start a YouTube movement, protect male colleagues from harassment for their senior women positions. Actually, it's equality. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I know the issue, the problem. Even I went through something similar, difficulties, especially in geisha parties. Often the way to treat their business colleagues and have a drinking party, big boys club in Asia is very rampant. And any lesser positions, even children, women, by even aggressors, should be stopped. That's one thing I agree. But however, one thing why it caused, because it's a stereotype of men, always should be macho and masculine, whatever, six-pack. Meanwhile, women should be already sexy dress and miniskirt and whatever, to be feminine, to attract a millionaire, billionaire to marry or to date and provide money. I think it's really going passe. So truly, I want to just say a little more equal ground. When we talk about women's liberation, I think not only liberate from man or tradition past, I think we need to liberate ourselves from our own biases, our own stereotypes, and be confident, because the era really emerged to take on new leadership. It is our compulsory duty, not anymore right to pursue. Meanwhile, equally, I want to really say, gentlemen here, I think you need to liberate yourself from your own stereotypes. So I often say, don't show up with a tie anymore. You can be pink pants and a lot of the flowery blouse, no problem. If you go these millennials in Asia now, really boys are, the real syndrome is a power lady and pretty boy syndrome. Because the women are really excelling, start earning money, becoming in leadership position. Now men are a little bit easy up. We don't have to be always sole breadwinner. And second, they really started pampering themselves, hairdo and skin do and something little platform high heel, and why not? So I think really for me it's not really, as I said, gender issue anymore. Right. Any biases and stereotypes restrain their potential, which should be stopped. Yeah. Any abuse should be stopped. Meanwhile, how can you really come out really for me again? And the work, the subject here, how can you start a new era, new leadership, which is a very well balanced men and women, even young leadership. Yeah. Even me, I have a 28 years old millennial. She said, "Mom, you are so ignorant, and you are in wrong industry. Fashion is that." I took it very seriously because they became our teacher, because they are already current and future leaders. So how we can really pave right environment, these new leadership excel, because certainly in their regard, there's no men and women. Yes. And really they are the one had to compete with the robot and live with the robot and AI. Next generation, I do worry we may be controlled by AI. How can we be superior? So how this education institute and training ground, because we have also lifelong training going on. Even my friend, I just shared with some other people, she just reached 60 years old. She came to me recently saying, "Well, now 60 is a new 40. Well, I'm going to plan to live around 120 years because prolonged lifespan. How can we re-educate ourselves to adjust to a new career, new environment, new whatever thing?" I think this is a positive thing we have to come out. So for me, because I've been sponsoring a lot of women's gathering around the world, now I think it's time for women to get out of that defense mode, blaming male game, which is so passive, coward from my point of view. Now it's time to progressively and more proactively how we can really fill up the gap, which we see it for future. Right. That's I think we have to take on.
Great. Well, we've got time for 15 minutes of questioning, I hope, and I hope it's going to be from a diverse group in the audience. Yes, so if you could raise your hands, and I will try and pick. Yes, the gentleman halfway back here on the. That's it. Thank you. If you could say who you are and where you're from, just to give us an idea.
Sure. Hi, my name's Joshua Nyong'o. I'm a student, master's student at Harvard University. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Google memo, and I have two quick questions attached to it. So the so-called Google memo was a a document released sometime last year that described that women were somehow handicapped from doing certain jobs because of biological reasons. So the first part of the question is, from a leadership standpoint, I think there is some difficulty, or some people shy away from diversity because it, at least initially, might lead to more conflict or more tension, especially when it comes to diversity of thought. And from a leadership perspective, how do we foster diversity, knowing that sometimes it can lead to these sorts of conflict, and how do we still manage diversity with that in mind? And then the second part of that question is, I think there's a real danger in ascribing stereotypes to genetics and to biology. At the same time, as you had described earlier, there's a real, so for some women, I think that it is really important for them to be able to have that time to spend with their family and so forth. And if a company were to make policies that specifically allowed for women to have that kind of time, would that essentially be ascribing some sort of policy to a biological or genetic reason for the same, in that same vein?
I just want to clarify that Women's March and myself, we are working tirelessly for equitable leave for childcare that is regardless of gender or no gender, So I think it's very important. I'll give you an example. I had to work for 8 years to get to the point where my husband could have his dream, which was that he had always wanted to stay at home with our children. And because of the government systems, because of the private sector in America being gender biased in a way that men do not receive the same rights as women when it comes to paternity leave, it took us this long to get to that point, and we had to really self-fund these efforts, So I think just to clarify, it's a problem for me as a woman, it's a problem for dads as well, and then it's an even bigger problem for people of the same gender or no gender at all who are parents and sharing children together. How do they get their paternity or maternity leave? And why are we making this distinction? So I just want to clarify that I don't believe there should be any distinction between leave policies for gender. And then what was your first question?
Well, I think we answered that. I'm going to take just one of the two questions. It's
okay.
Time, but I just want to quickly ask Cathy on the policy question, whether there is a way to avoid that appearing stereotype, and indeed ensuring that everybody takes it up, because if only one gender or group takes it up, then others feel deterred.
Right. Well, actually, on that one, Bob, I'll call and raise you, because you can, in fact, I know this because some have argued that, in fact, there's bias in being a parent, because that's your pursuit, and so you need time to do that. I have not made that, whoever has not made that choice, but they have another pursuit that is equally important and rewarding to them. So I'll tell you what we did at Deloitte. It's if you would like to take a leave, anybody, for any reason, 4 months, no questions asked. So we've gotten out of who's a parent, who's a this, who's an adopted parent, who's, because somebody was always feeling left out, and the whole idea was to be inclusive. Yeah. So now we just, for whatever reason you feel that you need this time, it's awarded to you.
Right, interesting. We're going to have a look at the results of the poll, see how honest you've been. So if we could flash up the results. So I'm not sure everyone's been honest there. 1% of you had the opportunity to help somebody who didn't look like most of the people in this room and didn't. I think that's low. Anyway, more questions from the floor. Going to see, yes, the woman in the middle there. Just can I get a mic here? Keep your hand up if you could. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. So I'm really glad that you clarified this term of diversity, because it seems like it is just gender, but for me it means racial diversity, it means class diversity. If you have 12 people who are all racially diverse, but they're of the same class, you're all the same, you're thinking the same, which can be problematic in a lot of different ways. And so I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on strategies that you're using in your companies, in your organizations, in order to try to employ the immense amount of diversity that we have.
Okay. Sung-Joo, do you want to just tackle that? Just
okay,
one strategy,
well,
perhaps one short strategy on...
Very hard. Well, we just, I mean, because we are a local company, as I said, 40 countries, 500 stores, now we are immensely working on this new digital transformation, SAP upgrading a new website. We understand not anymore top-down. Before there was some genius, they handled it. Not anymore, it's going to be collective genius era. It means the market is so volatile, especially when we talk about millennials, Gen, they have only 3-second attention level on the web page. That change of volatile. In that case, without having diversity by racial group, men and women, and age group, whatever, you have no way to win. So that's why now, instead of having one office building, often have a chairman, director, all this very hierarchy, we just broke it out. First of all, I gave up my office. I'm everywhere, wherever I am, one office, virtually connected, a cloud system, we can exchange all our data, and we are also working on one database, on customer database, by CRM tool in a Salesforce we are working with. And third will be also one inventory. So it doesn't matter physical location, whatever time zone, physiology, we call it omni-channel. That era emerging, it means we are hyper globalizing environment, multicultural, compulsory. If you look at our generation, I mean kids generation, we call it TGIF generation. You know what it stands for?
Right.
Not thanks God it's Friday.
No.
It is a Twitter and Google, Instagram, and Facebook era. In their era, there's no gender, no boundaries. That's so. If you want to be competitive in future, which is very near our current future,
so
diversity is yeah. So for me, it is just not adaptation. It is compulsory policy.
Right. Okay. More questions. Yes, gentlemen at the. Sort of, there are two questions there, but one the nearest one to me. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Drew Bonham. I'm a major in the U.S. Army, and I actually wanted to take an opportunity to give a perspective on the last presentation, real quick before I.
Could you stick to this one though? Really,
sure.
I think. But I know you will have a perspective on the last one.
Of course.
We've got 5 minutes. So.
Yep. My point is that dehumanization is part of the problem, and is certainly not part of how we train our officers. So I wanted to clarify that, and I know that the professor was put on the spot and may not have meant that. But for the panelists, I'm wondering, we're experiencing a transition point, and granted we were behind some other countries in the world when it comes to gender integration into the combat arms. And so I teach female students who are preparing to take over organizations that have been typically led by men. Mm-hmm. And some of their questions that they ask me is, can I be myself? Should I project what is expected of the stereotypical infantry officer? And so my question is, in your successful careers, have you felt that you're able to be yourselves, that you're able to, or do you feel like at times it's been necessary to project a certain image? Thank you.
Interestingly, there was a publicity campaign for the British Army that used a female officer asking that very question to try and attract recruits. Can I be myself? And answering, obviously, yes, because they wanted to attract recruits.
Can I go? Because train station.
Yeah, sure. Sung-Joo needs
if
to.
If you don't mind,
I
have to catch my train back to Zurich now.
I'll ask.
Forgive me. Thank you so much.
So I'll ask while Sung-Joo's making her exit, I'll ask Cathy to answer that question about being yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for your service. I'm the proud mom of a first lieutenant in the Army, Fort Bragg. I would say you need to be authentic. We all need to be authentic. Now, obviously, there are certain combat protocols and the like that need to be followed, but there is a way to do it with your own uniqueness and authenticity.
And have you personally felt that you have been able to be authentic throughout your career?
Oh, yeah. I can't say it's always worked in my favor. But, yeah, And I feel really comfortable about that.
Right.
So, and when, you know, maybe there was some bias, I just blamed it on the red hair, actually.
Right. Bob, authenticity?
I would say that we, especially those of us from marginalized communities or women who are going into industries that are majority male at this point, we have no choice. We have to be ourselves. We have to insist that that is our right, because if we do not, nothing will change. So a lot of the right way to be is based on whatever the system is that's already in place. So if it's majority white, if it's majority upper class, if it's majority men, whatever the largest majority group is, you're going to feel that push to be that certain way, but we're never going to achieve a more inclusive space until we make room for that. And that starts with us.
Great. One last question. Who would like to pose it to wrap up this panel? Yeah. If you could keep it relatively concise.
Okay, so my question, I'm from Toronto, diverse city, but one of the things is sometimes when you're when you're doing a movement, for example, the beginning part when there's really gross discrimination that's really obvious, it's easy to get people inspired. But the last 10%, that nuance where how do you keep people inspired and how do you explain it to maybe people that don't even realize their privilege, I guess, and how do you make them aware of it? Because I think that's kind of where the energy fades from any type of movement, and how do you kind of get to that last 10%?
Right, that's a good question.
It's not easy, and I have to say that with the women's, if Trump hadn't been elected after saying you know, grabs him by the pussy and all that stuff, you know, that wouldn't, I don't know if we would have gotten to the place where women were shocked to their core and that opened them up to other things like, oh, you know, am I creating violence in my community through using my whiteness without critical analysis? Am I being Islamophobic? Am I being anti-immigrant in small ways? You know, implicit bias training is very essential. We're seeing it right now with what happened at Starbucks in America, which is explicit bias, but then also there's so many examples of this. And it takes people who are passionate telling their story, telling other people why they care, and then being trained to learn how to lead these sort of trainings and bring them into your everyday life and to other groups. But oftentimes that sort of complacency is something that we have to fight against. And I found that storytelling is one of the most important parts of it. It's all about human connection.
Cathy, one last word?
Yeah, you know, well, it might not be ending on an upper, but if we look at Me Too, there's a downside to Me Too. There's an unintended consequence that seems to be happening in the corporate world around Me Too. And that is that some of the men, they're just now, whoa, I could either take this younger female colleague on, you know, on a business trip, you know, it would be a great learning and development opportunity for her, but I'm not going there. Or I'd really like to, you know, mentor this person, but I'm just not going there. And we have to be really careful about that too, that we don't over-index the other way, because that really doesn't help anyone. You can appreciate where it comes from, but you know, 99% of the time, you know, it's all well-founded, and in terms of the effort that goes into, you know, mentoring and counseling and coaching and sponsoring diverse people of all types, and just don't want that to get muted in an over-response to Me Too.
Great. Well,
and I would just say that we're just at the beginning of that movement, and it's not something where women should feel like they need to be silenced in order to have opportunities. But then also I think we all collectively as a society share responsibility for the work that has to be done around dismantling toxic masculinity in our societies and teaching boys from the time they're boys proper consent and how to interact with women in a healthy way.
Good. We could go on. We certainly should go on this particular movement. And let me thank Sung-Joo, Cathy, Bob Bland. Please thank them for us.
Thank you, Andrew.